Hello, and welcome back to Off the Beaten Path. I'm your host, Stan Deep with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of May 22nd, 2025. We are coming to you this week once again from the Whites of Their Eyes division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest today is author and historian Rick Atkinson, who joins me to talk about his new book on the American Revolution, the second volume in his Revolution Trilogy. Rick Atkinson was born in Munich, Germany, the son of a U.S. Army officer, and grew up on military posts. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from East Carolina University and a Master of Arts degree in English Literature from the University of Chicago. Rick's journalism career began at the Pittsburgh Morning Sun in Pittsburgh, Kansas in 1976. In 1977, he moved to the Kansas City Times before going to the Washington Post in 1983. He worked as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor for 2 decades at the Washington Post. His last assignments were covering the 101st Airborne during the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and writing about roadside bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2007. Among other assignments, he served as the Post Berlin bureau chief, covering not only Germany and NATO, but also spending considerable time in Somalia and Bosnia. He won the 1982 Pulitzer-Prize for national reporting and the 1999 Pulitzer-Prize for public service while at the Washington Post. Rick's first book was entitled The Long Gray Line, The American Journey of the West Point Class of 1966, published by Houghton Mifflin in 1989. His next book, Crusade, The Untold Story of the Persian Gulf War, published by Houghton Mifflin in 1993. He also wrote In the Company of Soldiers, A Chronicle of Combat, published by Henry Holt in 2004, an account of his time with General David Petraeus and the 101st Airborne Division during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Rick is also the author of the acclaimed Liberation Trilogy, a narrative history of the liberation of Europe in World War II. The first volume, entitled An Army at Dawn, The War in North Africa, 1942 to 1943, was published by Henry Holt in 2002 and received the Pulitzer Prize in History the very next year. The second volume was The Day of Battle, The War in Sicily and Italy, 1943 to 1944, published by Henry Holt in 2007. The final volume of the Liberation Trilogy was The Guns at Last Light, The War in Western Europe, 1944 to 1945, published by Henry Holt in 2013. The New York Times Book Review described the Liberation Trilogy as, quote, a monumental achievement, unquote. The first volume of the Revolution Trilogy was published by Henry Holt in 2019, entitled The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. Rick joined me on this podcast to talk about that book on October 15th, 2020. You can find it on Off the Beaten Path. In 2019, he was named a Vincent J. Dooley Distinguished Fellow at the Georgia Historical Society. Rick's latest book is Volume 2 of the Revolution Trilogy, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, entitled The Fate of the Day, The War for America, Fort Ticonderoga to Charleston, 1777 to 1780, published on April 29th of this year by Crown. It was reviewed by George Will in the Washington Post on April 16th and by Amy Greenberg in the New York Times on April 29th. Who said, and I quote, "There is no better writer of narrative history than the Pulitzer Prize-winning Atkinson," unquote. She wrote that this second volume is so compulsively readable that it's difficult to put down, and concluded, "This is great history," unquote. And I wholeheartedly agree. My conversation with my friend Rick Atkinson begins now. Rick Atkinson, welcome back to our podcast.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks for having me back.
Well, I had to check the book publication dates. It tells me that there were 6 years in between these books. I don't know if there will be 6 years between the second and third volume, but I don't know how much. I started out last time asking you about research, and I will ask you again there. This time, of course, you had to deal with this thing called COVID right in the middle of your research, that I'm sure as you were getting started. From the jump, the first thing I'm going to ask you, well, I'll save that question. We'll come back to that. but I'm going to ask you about your research. The last time we talked about your the first volume, you took us through going to Windsor Castle, being able to access George III's archives. Really, almost the first person to do that. Take us through the ordeal of researching, or maybe the adventure of researching, Volume 2 of this trilogy.
Yeah, well, it is an adventure, as you well know. The mystery of the next unopened archival box is one of the charms of what it is that we do. I didn't go back to Windsor because I didn't really need to, and the papers have now been mostly digitized, which was the whole point of Queen Elizabeth opening up the Georgian papers, the papers of all four Georges who were king in the 18th and 19th centuries, was to digitize and catalog that collection. And of the 500,000 pages, most of them are from the reign of George III, because he was king for almost 60 years. I didn't go back to Windsor this time, but I went to pretty much every place else that I had been to for Volume 1. And that includes, the wonderful archive and library in Ann Arbor, the William Clements Library, which, as you know, has an extraordinary collection of the papers of a number of British generals and British statesmen from the 18th century, and to places like the New York Historical Society. I spend a lot of time in the library of the Society of the Cincinnatus, which is here in Washington, not far from my house. I'm a regular there because they have a great library. So, I had learned my way around the archives for the American Revolution doing Volume 1, and they're quite different from the archive that I felt like I had pretty well mastered for World War II. They just happened to be in different places. And so, having spent a fair amount of time learning where those places were and learning my way around those archives, I felt that when I started Volume 2, I had a leg up on the game this time. And as usual, I spend about 3 years researching both primary and secondary stuff. I feel obliged to read everything. It's physically impossible, of course, but I make a run at it. And that includes going through the founders' papers. Behind me in my office in Washington, I've got a lot of the volumes of George Washington. The University of Virginia is almost finished curating those papers from the Revolutionary War. They began in 1968. The end is in sight. I think they anticipate finishing around 2028. And there's 750 pages each, roughly. And I've read volumes 1 through 28 at this point. The papers of Nathaniel Greene, the papers of John Adams, all of these are now largely available online, which is a wonderful thing that the different repositories have done for the nation. And so, 3 years or so to research. I usually put a mark on the wall saying, at this point, I will stop, because you can wander into the woods, never wander out. And then I began to put the book together, and that's what I did with this volume, The Fate of the Day.
Did you go to Paris to do research?
I did not. Instead, I don't read French, but I retained a very good young French scholar. She actually got her PhD in England, and so she's utterly fluent in English. And she worked the French archives for me, the naval archives, the diplomatic archives. She translated a number of secondary sources for me. And I spent my time instead, as I often do in London, at the British National Archive in Kew, especially, and elsewhere.
So are the French records for this period and their deep involvement in the Revolution, have they been published? Are they available on microfilm, or are these still kind of untapped in the archives there?
Bits and pieces of them have been published, Stan, and they are mostly on microfilm or microfiche, which, as you know, is not a joy to work with. But my researcher did a good job. She knew her way around those archives reasonably well. And I had some specific ideas of what I was looking for, ship records and things like that. And, as you might imagine, in the long, spectacular history of France, that little period where they were involved in the French and the American Revolution was not all that consequential from a French standpoint. But they're proud of their role in helping and proud of the friendship that began with that assistance they gave us. And I'm grateful to the archivists who helped us along the way.
One of the things that we want to do here is talk about really this cast of characters that you had to write about. I mean, these are some of the most famous names in history, obviously not just American history, but before we get to that, we one of the things I like to always ask authors about, particularly somebody who's working on such a vast canvas as you are, is do you outline? Do you know where you're going before you get started? I know you probably have mapped out how long this volume is going to be. It's going to cover from this to this. But do you work from a pretty extensive outline, or do you just start writing when you've done some research?
Oh, I spend usually about 8 months outlining. The outline for this book, as with most books, is about 3 times longer than the book itself. I think the outline for The Fate of the Day is about 700,000 or 800,000 words. The book itself is about 260,000 words, which is a long book. I can't imagine writing anything. Back when I was a newspaper reporter, I would always outline, in cursory fashion, at least, a day story that I was doing that was something quite short. I need the roadmap. I need to have a clear sense of where I'm going, not only month to month, but day to day and almost hour to hour. And the way that I construct the outlines that I do, it shows me where the information is in my notes. So that when it comes time to write, I can access it quickly and easily and have it at hand. I spend every afternoon reading back through what I've written in the morning and then preparing for the next day's writing. And that largely consists of taking the pertinent section of outline and pulling my notes that are going to be needed for the next day's writing and refining that outline. I basically outline the outline and make it more granular. When I talk to young writers, young scholars, I preach the glories of outlining. It's incredibly tedious. That 8 months or so is always among the most miserable 8 months of my life because it's really painstaking and it's a slog. But when I'm finished, then I have a pretty confident sense that I know where I'm going and how to get there.
Shelby Foote did that for his 3-volume Civil War. I've heard him talk about it. And you said you do a lot of reading. You read for about 3 years. Do you write while you're reading, or do you set all of that aside and then you outline and start writing?
Yeah, I don't do any writing until I'm finished the research. You're never completely finished because new books come out and you find things and so on. But basically, I do declare myself to be done with the research so that I can move along. I keep a sign next to my writing desk. I can see it right now, in fact, and it says "Get on with it," and that is my mantra. And so I wait until I'm finished the research or announced to myself that I am finished, and then I begin the outlining. I do the outlining, and then I begin the writing. And the writing of a big book, I've now done 8 of them, and it usually takes me about a year. I'm a pretty fast writer. I was an old newspaper man, so I can type real fast, and I'm accustomed to writing, 1,000 or 1,200 words a day. So The process is important, and the process, the comfort of repetition and following that process is important to me in getting where I want to go.
And take us, you mentioned that you write in the morning and then you sort of look over and revise in the afternoon, but take us through a writing day, a typical writing day of how it works for you.
Yeah, I'm lucky living in Washington, D.C. My commute is about 15 feet, which by Washington standards is pretty good.
Hmm.
I get up pretty early, 6 o'clock or so, and get right to it. I will usually read again first thing in the morning what I've written the previous day. So it's 1,000 words or so to read. And I might make some fixes and corrections as I'm doing that, but then I get on with it. And I've got that fragment of the outline that I prepared the previous day, and I've got my notes right here at hand. And I, get after it. My ambition usually is to try to write scenes and to stop when I've finished a scene. I want the narrative to be about character and about the drama of a scene. I want it to have a sense of drama. And I will write until usually 11 or 12, and it starts to turn to gibberish by that point. And so I stop and, start, as I said, spend the afternoon editing myself and preparing for the next day. And I will read the day's writing again in the evening after dinner, usually, sometimes even with a glass of wine. It somehow seems to improve the prose, or else show me the error of my ways. And then I'll start it all over again. And I usually work 7 days a week when I'm writing a book. Sometimes I'll take a Sunday afternoon off or something like that. And I try not to be too hysterical about it, because I know that you can burn yourself out. But once I get rolling, I like to keep rolling.
Is it possible for you to break off from it for a week and then pick it right back up if you take a speaking gig or you have to travel for any reason?
I do, but I like to try to avoid it, because I think there is a sense of momentum. I sometimes talk about the narrative art, writing narrative as a form of brachiating. To brachiate is to, like gibbons and orangutans do in the treetops, or kids do on monkey bars. You use the momentum of your body as you're swinging with your arms over your head. You're swinging from branch to branch, using the momentum of your body to keep moving. And I think that's what narrative writing is about. If you're not brachiating, you're hanging still. You're just hanging from that old tree branch, and that's not good. And so anything that disrupts this notion of momentum is problematic for me, because you got to pick it back up somehow. So I've got 4 grandkids now, and they are a wonderful time sump. And I try to remember that that's a lot more important than anything I've got to say on a page on any given day. But for the most part, I am pretty disciplined about it.
This book goes from, as your subtitle says, from Fort Ticonderoga in 1777 through some of the most momentous battles of the Revolution. Bennington, Saratoga, Germantown, Monmouth Courthouse. But before, I don't want to take us chronologically through everything and just have you rehash all of that. This is a great story, and you've told it beautifully. What I would like to start out by asking you is, across the 600 pages of narrative here, what was the most difficult part of this book for you to write, to wrap your arms around, wrestle it to the ground, and then deliver it into narrative? Because you cover a lot of ground in this book, geographically and chronologically.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, the war becomes a world war during this span. And we're not just fighting in the 13 colonies. It's no longer just a brush fire on the edge of the British Empire.
Right.
It's on its way to being fought on 4 continents and in the 7 seas. So you're absolutely right about that. I think one of the most difficult things always is to move from the tactical to the operational to the strategic. And those are military terms that the military today uses. Tactical is, what's happening in foxholes, what's happening on the front lines. Operational is kind of the movement of large groups of men and brigades or divisions. And the strategic is the big arrows on the map. It's what the national military leadership is doing. And I try to operate on all three levels because I think you've got to do that in order to tell the story comprehensively. So, shifting from what's happening at Brandywine, for example, in September 1777, which is a ferocious tactical fight, lasts one day. It's a defeat for the home team. And it's very intricate and it's very hard to understand what happened in retrospect. There's a lot of confusion about, it's the fog of war is never foggier than when it's in the 18th century. And the source material is contradictory and so on. And Brandywine can be hard to understand. And you can go and walk the ground as I have, and it's even hard to understand then. But I do my best, and I think I sorted it out reasonably well. But then to move from that to those big arrows on the map and to try to understand what it is that the National Congress is doing or what Franklin is doing with the French in Paris, or God help us, what George III and Prime Minister North and American Secretary George Germain are doing in London at the same time, without losing the thread of what's happening on the battlefield, and trying to keep them all coherent and linked together, because they obviously are linked together. I think that's probably the biggest challenge in writing these big narrative war books.
And you start out in Paris. I mean, the very first page, we're right there talking about Louis and Marie Antoinette, and we follow Benjamin Franklin and his compatriots there who are working hard to bring in the French as our allies, which they eventually do. And then you go over to London. I mean, you're right. There's a big story, and occasionally you sort of have to peek at what's happening in Madrid too, because the Spanish are going to get involved in this, according to their, what the French are doing, even though they're never really our allies, so to speak. Did you find any of that difficult, or writing about the global conflict of World War II? Did you kind of prepare you? And I know you've been, as you said, a reporter. So you're used to swimming in those waters where there's this big thing going on up here, but at the same time, you're describing the death of some of these people in absolutely poetic terms. I mean, it flows seamlessly. So that's a big question, I guess. But did you find your reporter training good to sort of keep an eye on the global conflict? Because there's a lot going on in Europe. You can't tell this story just from America.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Stan. Yeah, I do open in Versailles, actually, at the palace, and we open with Marie Antoinette, and it's the Lent is about to begin, so Mardi Gras is on us, basically the French version of Mardi Gras. And I did that because I wanted, first of all, they're fun to write about Louis XVI. Our future is in the hands of Louis XVI. And his queen, Madame Deficit, as Marie Antoinette is known in the French court because she's such a spendthrift. They are critical to the success of the rebellion, and I wanted to introduce them fully so you can get some sense of their character, and also to understand where the French are at this point. Why does an absolute monarchy decide to align itself with wannabe Republicans who are intent on waging war against their lawful monarch? This is not something that you would expect from the French absolute monarchy. So, I open with them. We will come back to Versailles and Paris periodically. Franklin is there. He is the man. He's our first and greatest diplomat, and his job is to persuade Louis that this is in his best interest. And then we've also, we're with a 19-year-old spindly redhead named Gilbert du Motier, whom you know better as Marquis de Lafayette, because he's just been given a major general's commission in the Continental Army, even though his military experience is virtually nil as a captain in the French military. So it signals, I think, to the reader that this is going to be a big canvas, that it's a complex story, but the characters are very engrossing, and that this isn't just going to be about a sequence of battles in the 13 colonies, that in fact, to understand why those battles have their significance, why the Americans can keep fighting, why it's important to the fate of the world, actually, not just the fate of the 13 American states as they are now. You've got to understand this broader context. And it's fun to write about. I have always felt, when I was writing a lot about World War II, getting away from the battlefield is important. It's important to me, and it's important to the reader. Relentless combat is really exhausting. And I think it's important to have the opportunity to write about what London is like in 1777, what Paris is like, to have a respite from Oriskany or Saratoga or Savannah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You sort of answered the flip side of the question was what was most difficult was what was most fun about writing about, again, this broad canvas, 3 years of American history and really European history. What part did you enjoy the most, and was that it?
Well, the characters are, that's what keeps me going. War is always about character, and boy, what characters have we got? Trying to understand them, trying to penetrate the impenetrable. George Washington is a pretty opaque guy. And trying to understand who he really is beneath that reserved veneer of his. And the cast of characters is enormous. They're engrossing to me. I find George III to be endlessly fascinating. He is not the fool that we see mincing across the stage of Hamilton every night singing "You'll Be Back." He's a constitutional monarch who's a man of substance. He's a patron of the arts. He's a patron of science.
Bibliophile.
He's a tremendous bibliophile, 65,000 volumes in his library that become the basis for the Great British Library. And he's not an autocrat. That's simply a misreading of him. We Americans have come to think of him as a dolt and a tyrant, as he's so declared in the Declaration of Independence. The royal brute, as Thomas Paine calls him in Common Sense. Well, he's not. He can be a badass. There's no doubt about that. And he can be so willfully stubborn that at one point he's ready to abdicate rather than ease up in the war that he's waging against the colonists in America. So trying to understand the complexities of him and the complexities of many other characters is a challenge, but gosh, it's really fun. It gives you the opportunity to do what novelists do. It's got to be rooted, obviously, in the historical record to beat the band. But nevertheless, there are aspects of writing about characters like this that I think are similar to the joys of a fiction writer.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the cast of characters, and obviously some of these people repeat coming back from volume one. Some of them are brand new, including, I think, the triumvirate of people. I remember talking with you about this, that Lafayette and Hamilton and John Lawrence were coming on the scene, but they weren't there yet.
Yeah.
They're here in this volume, particularly Lafayette. And it's still one of the most amazing things that here this, as you say, 19, 20-year-old kid comes over and somehow ingratiates himself with Washington in what appeared to have been a real relationship. This was not just put on. I don't think any Washington put on for anybody. He understood the diplomatic consequences, but this seemed to be a genuine friendship between these two. more like father and son, as so many people have said. What did you make of that relationship through this book?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is genuine. Who can completely understand chemistry? Washington has no children of his own, of course.
Mm-hmm.
It's believed that he was probably sterile as a consequence of contracting smallpox as a young man in a trip to Barbados, the only time he ever left the continental United States. And he had a knack for subordinate talent. He recognized in people like Henry Knox, a 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller, that, hey, this guy's going to be the father of American artillery. Or Nathaniel Greene, a lapsed Quaker from Rhode Island, could be a somewhat difficult personality, but he's second only to Washington in the pantheon of American generals in the Continental Army. And by the way, when the supply system is collapsing, he turns out to be one of the great quartermasters in military history. So Washington has an eye for subordinate talent. And there's something about this young Frenchman when he shows up on Little Neshaminy Creek in the summer of 1777, having crossed the Atlantic. He bought a boat. He went against the king's orders not to leave France. He sails and he lands in South Carolina and makes his way to Philadelphia, and then ultimately makes his way to Washington's camp. Washington is a man who, first of all, he recognizes the importance of transactional relationships, and he knows that having good relations with the French is vital to his cause.
Mm-hmm.
And Lafayette is a portal into a good relationship. He's one of the richest men in France. Even though he's in bad odor with the king right now, he's got very powerful friends and family in France. Washington knows this. But beyond that, Lafayette has a capacity for ingratiating himself. He's genuinely eager. He's got the bit in his teeth when it comes to all of the fine things that the Americans claim they believe in regarding the rights of man, and what they're trying to accomplish in America is something that Lafayette really believes. Washington responds to that. It turns out that Lafayette's a pretty good tactical leader. He can be reckless at times. He's certainly lucky at times. But when he's given command, and that happens pretty soon, he acquits himself well, and Washington trusts him on the battlefield. So, we see this relationship develop so quickly that after the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, Monmouth is Freehold. It's the hometown of Bruce Springsteen in northern New Jersey. After this battle, which has been almost a catastrophe for the Americans, and the day is saved really at the last minute, and the British basically are driven off, Washington and Lafayette go to sleep together under an oak tree after this exhausting day, covered by the same cloak. It's a tender, somewhat sentimental scene, but it captures the relationship that has grown up between them. And I think it's not unreasonable to speak of it as kind of a father-son relationship. Well, Lafayette will remain near and dear to Washington and to all Americans for the rest of his life. And part of that is his abiding relationship with Washington.
Yeah, you even write about the reunion when Lafayette has been he returns to France, and he comes back near the end of this book, and is welcomed back. You said with Washington had tears in his eyes.
Yeah, that's right, and it's like that. We're going to see these reunions again, where they've been apart, they come back together, and there's a real joyful embrace. Washington likes being in his company. He trusts him. He knows how important he is to the cause. Lafayette's very popular. There's not a jealousy that you might have expected with this interloper insinuating his way into the inner circle. It's not like that. He's got the ability to get people like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox and others to appreciate him. They like his company. They respect his capacities as a military man, and they also know that he's very important to what we're trying to get from France.
We mentioned the relationship with Washington, more like a father and son. And, people, I think, mistakenly think that Hamilton and Washington had that relationship, and they very much did not. Hamilton always kept Washington at arm's length, and vice versa. He was much more of an aide, really. I mean, they never really developed that close relationship. Is that correct?
That's right. And in fact, they have a bit of a falling out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Hamilton he's a different cat. He's more complex in some ways than Lafayette. They are actually good friends, Lafayette
Yes.
and Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
But Hamilton arrives on Washington's staff as a lieutenant colonel. He's been a young artillery officer, a capable artillery officer, early in the war, and he's probably got the biggest brain of any of them. He's extraordinarily capable. He thinks he's field marshal material. He's in his 20s, and yet he doesn't hesitate to second guess his uppers and betters in the general officer ranks, and he is always ready to offer tactical and operational advice. But he's got a great capacity for knowing what he can do to serve the boss's needs. When Washington needs a letter written, or he needs a message taken to somebody important in Philadelphia or wherever, or just needs advice, he will listen to Hamilton because Hamilton is very articulate. He's got the capacity for analytical thinking. His mind, like Washington's, is organized for executive action. Washington recognizes that. And yet Hamilton, he's got some skepticism about what John Adams calls the superstitious veneration that many Americans have for Washington. No man is a hero to his valet. And there's a bit of that going on with Hamilton. He's not exactly a valet, but pretty close, being an aide to the commanding general. Yeah. And so he's got some skepticism about, Washington in general.
And I think it was after the British evacuated Philadelphia and they're moving across New Jersey, and this is when Monmouth happens. But I think it's you describing Washington calls a council of war, and to a man, they all say, no. It would be a huge mistake to attack this army as they're moving across it. I think it was Hamilton who described them all as a council of midwives or something, which is, again, the great quote you always manage to find. This is your notes going back to the research, but I think I've got that story correct.
Yes,
but,
you do. That is exactly what he calls them. There's Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton deciding that he knows better than, a dozen generals.
Yeah, as you say, at about 22 years old, I'm sure he thought he probably could have fought the war better than most of those people.
Yep.
And speaking of those people, so I want to talk about some of them now individually. There's the British side, which is, again, you do a great job of describing it. Henry Clinton, right? The two Howell brothers. Cornwallis makes an appearance here before it's over. But Clinton and Howe are really the two main British adversaries in this book. But I want to start with somebody. We mentioned him in the first book because he was at Charleston. He was then captured, and then he's released. And he's just seemingly such a fascinating person. And that's Charles Lee. And you mentioned Monmouth, that June 28th. 1778 was a fateful day for Charles Lee, for Lafayette, for Washington, eventually, of course, for John Laurens as well, who fights a duel with Lee, and you talk about that. Sort of take us through the Charles Lee story, if you will. He's one of the more fascinating and I think tragic figures in the entire Revolution.
Yeah, he certainly is, Stan. And I also find him endlessly fascinating, partly because his trajectory is so catastrophic.
Yeah.
He'd been a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He'd had a lot of experience, combat experience and otherwise. And he's a restless character. He's basically decides that he's not going to be able to get ahead in Britain. And so he emigrates, and he ends up in America not long before the Revolution. He imbibes radical politics here. He's a true believer in everything that the American radicals, the Samuel Adamses, believe. He's gifted as a writer, and he writes a lot on behalf of the American cause. He's a gifted gabber, and he gabs a lot. Americans tend to be bewitched by him because he is so outspoken and flamboyant. He dresses flamboyantly. He's got a selection of uniforms that are, right out of Central costuming. He's, appointed a general in the New Continental Army, and he soon becomes Washington's number two. He's basically deputy commander of the army, and he shows himself to be quite capable. Washington relies on him. When the army moves to New York, Lee is sent there first to start working on defenses, knowing that the British are coming. He provides advice that Washington finds useful. It's usually pretty good advice, not always. You mentioned Charleston. He goes to Charleston. The British Navy is launched basically a big raid. It's not clear quite what they're trying to do. And they are repulsed. Now, technically, Charles Lee is the senior commander on the scene. It's actually South Carolinians who have organized the defenses and who repulse remarkably this British attack. They defeat the Royal Navy is what it amounts to. Charles Lee is there, and he's useful on the scene. He gets some credit for that. He doesn't neglect to praise the South Carolinians for their heroic defense of Sullivan's Island and Charleston itself. And then it all starts to come unstitched for him. In December of 1776, he is moving slowly with his portion of the army to rejoin Washington, who's lost New York and is in Pennsylvania trying to decide what to do. And Lee gets himself captured. He separates himself foolishly from his force, and a British raiding party knows where he is. They've got good intelligence, and they capture him. And so he's going to spend the next 18 months or so in British jail in New York, some of it on a British prison ship. When he is exchanged and he comes back to join Washington at Valley Forge, Washington's glad to see him. The troops, he's quite popular with the soldiers. There's a lot of huzzas around him. General Lee is back, and now we can get on with the war, leaving the brutal encampment at Valley Forge and getting ready to move. At Monmouth, he is given command of the vanguard of the army, and his task is to move parallel, more or less, to the retreating British army that has abandoned Philadelphia and is headed back to New York. Lee's orders from Washington are not as specific and clear as they ought to have been. This is partly Washington's fault. And Lee gets himself into tactical difficulties of the first order. He's up against Henry Clinton, who's a good battlefield commander. Clinton is just trying to get his long column from Philadelphia to New York in some of the hottest weather New Jersey has ever experienced. It's a brutally hot day, June 28th, 1778. Several dozen men die of heat stroke on both sides. Lee finds himself in peril, and instead of harassing and attacking the flanks of this British column, finds himself retreating and in some danger, some peril of his vanguard, we're talking 5,000 men, being smashed. Washington shows up on the battlefield, has a confrontation with Lee that is one of the most severe rebukes that Washington will ever give anyone at any point in his entire life, demanding, sir, what is the meaning of this? How have you managed to get yourself into such a predicament? Lee sputters, tries to explain himself. Washington wants nothing to do with it, dismisses him. Lee loses his temper, loses his cool, writes a couple of intemperate notes to the commanding general, and is arrested and court-martialed. this is going to be the end of Charles Lee. His battlefield performance was pardonable. His impertinence to the commanding general is not. And he has set himself up basically to give the Army and the Congress a choice: Washington or Charles Lee. Well, that's not a choice. And so Lee is going to be cashiered from the Army. He lives a kind of pathetic life. He does fight a duel against Hamilton. He fights several duels, actually, because he has offended the honor of Washington, and those who want to defend Washington's honor challenge Lee to a duel. He's going to die young in Philadelphia, having been ostracized from the Army, having lost most of his friends, having lost most of his fortune, such as it is. He dies all but forgotten in Philadelphia. It's one of the greatest crash and burns in American military history. He goes from being the number 2 guy in the Continental Army to being a man who is vilified for the most part. It's a sad story, and you can't help but feel for Charles Lee that this is not exactly what he had in mind when he came here to fight for American liberty.
Yeah. You sort of split that up into 2 parts: what happened on the battlefield versus what he did with his mouth and his pen afterwards. But
Yeah.
militarily, do you think he got a raw deal? Because you make it a point to say a couple of times in the narrative that Washington's orders that day were ambiguous, and Lee, when he met up with Washington in retreat, expected to be congratulated for extracting that part of the army and saving it, as you mentioned, because he would have been just run over. And instead, Washington, and according to legend, said all kind of things, right? That we don't really know what he said, except that he was not happy. Lee was astounded. He's not the reaction he expected from Washington, and then sort of insisted on this court martial to clear his name, which went very, very badly. But did he get a raw deal, or did he really screw up that day?
Well, I think he got a raw deal, to be honest with you. I think that he did what he had to do to save his command. It got to the point where his vanguard of 5,000 men was facing the better part of 13 or 14,000 who had wheeled around during this retreat toward New York and were coming on strong. The ground was not good. It did not favor Lee's position. Lee somewhat lost control of some of his forces. Some of the units began to retreat without orders, and he lost control of the battle. Now, there were several things that Lee didn't do well. First of all, he didn't really know this command. He'd been away from the Army for so long while he was in British prison. He didn't know his subordinates. He did not do reconnaissance of the battlefield the previous night, as he should have. He did not properly interrogate his senior subordinates about what British dispositions were and what they thought, what they would recommend, and so on. So he was a mediocrity at best when it came to June 28th, 1778. But the fact that Washington didn't want to hear any of this, that Washington's orders had been ambiguous and not very precise, that Washington had allowed himself, with the main part of the army, to straggle too far behind the vanguard so they were not within easy reinforcing distance. That was a mistake, tactical mistake by Washington. And then, turning with a fury on this guy and accusing him of misconduct publicly, because there were other officers around listening to this browbeating that Washington was delivering. I think that was unfair to Lee. They could have patched things over, but Lee was intemperate, consequently, and things spun out of control so quickly that there was no doubt that this was going to end badly for Lee.
Mm-hmm. And you described the one of the duels that he had with John Laurens, who was, of course, defending Washington's honor from some of the
Yeah,
things that Lee wrote in the aftermath of all that. And it's a charming story, really, about how these two fired at each other at point blank range, and Laurens hit. Of course, Laurens will throw his life away a few years later.
yep,
But he hits Lee, and Lee says, I could have hugged the charming boy,
yes.
but he never forgave Washington. That is, Lee did not. He hated him, I think, to the very end.
And became a thorn in his side, and was trying to muster his allies in Congress against Washington, and continued to write intemperately about Washington. This is a losing proposition for Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Washington, by this point, is already known as the father of his country, and there is this superstitious veneration about him. So this is a foolish, but this is part of who Charles Lee is. He's a flawed character with a penchant for self-inflicted wounds.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting. It's Horatio Gates is one of the other commanding military figures in this book, who's of course the hero of Saratoga. Who I often thought it's interesting to look at Charles Lee's fate. He is relieved of command. Gates, unfortunately, is not relieved of command. He gets sent down south, and his military career gets absolutely ruined. We'll hear about that in Volume 3.
Yeah.
I know you'll enjoy writing about that. But the battle between and I do want to talk about Savannah too, of course, since I'm sitting in Georgia and you're going to be coming down here. But Saratoga, of course, is always seen as sort of the turning point, right? It's there that the French finally decide to come in after receiving word. It's when the British really began to despair. What are we doing? And you mentioned George III, and one of the things that struck me about this is there are times, it seems, in your narrative when the only reason the British continue this is because George III absolutely refuses to give it up. I mean, you even say at one point in a speech in Parliament, maybe in 1778 or 79, maybe 80, he's still lamenting that he gave in on the Stamp Act business 15 years earlier. So that's a broad question, and I want to talk. I want you to talk about the Burgoyne, who's a lovable man. I mean, that's somebody you really want to dig in and really read about. Burgoyne and Gates, but also the sense of how important Saratoga was, both in continuing the conflict with French support, and the British not giving up at that point.
Yeah. Well, the British have decided that invading into New York from Canada down the Hudson Valley is potentially a war-winning strategy because you can cleave off New England, separate it from the Middle States, and cause all kinds of logistical problems, among other things, for the Americans. And so John Burgoyne, who is indeed a lovable character just because he's flamboyant and pretty capable. He's a famous playwright. He's a successful playwright. He's going to become a famous playwright. The problem with the British is there are conflicting opinions about what should be done, and there's nobody in London sorting out these different opinions. So that as Burgoyne is headed south, and he's bringing about 8,000 men with him, with the intent of getting at least to Albany and maybe all the way to New York City, General Howe, commanding the main British army in New York, decides he's going to go in the opposite direction. He is going to go to Philadelphia, and he's eventually going to capture Philadelphia. But the problem with doing that is he's not available to join Burgoyne at Albany or wherever. He's not available to reinforce Burgoyne if Burgoyne gets in trouble. And this is part and parcel of British strategic incoherence. This makes no sense that you have two armies basically moving away from each other. So when Burgoyne succeeds in capturing Ticonderoga at the south end of Lake Champlain, routing the American garrison there, and then moves into the Hudson River Valley and begins moving south along the Hudson, things are looking pretty good. This is the summer of 1777. What Burgoyne doesn't appreciate is that, first of all, the rallying to the cause is beginning in earnest in the Hudson River Valley, so that you have not only militia forces from throughout New England and New York State coming to oppose his march south, but also you've got the Continental Army, which has been evicted from Fort Ticonderoga, but that army has been saved. It has not been destroyed. And they're going to be reinforced, and Horatio Gates is in command. And they're in a good position to do what ultimately is done to Burgoyne. That is, A, stop him, then trap him, and finally to destroy him. And those things happen sequentially in the two battles at Saratoga in September and then October of 1777. Things have started badly at Bennington. Burgoyne's German allies go wandering off toward New England looking for horses and other supplies. They're also trapped, and that detachment is destroyed. So the upshot of Saratoga, which does show Gates to be, I think, a capable battlefield commander. He does what he needs to do, including allowing his best tactical commander, a brigadier general who's going to become a major general named Benedict Arnold, to do his thing. Arnold's very aggressive. He knows how to fight. He knows how to rally the men under him. And Arnold is a hero at Saratoga. He's badly wounded again. He has been badly wounded in the battle for Quebec about a year and a half earlier. The news out of Saratoga that Burgoyne has surrendered and that he has managed over the course of the summer and fall of 1777 to lose his entire army with almost no one escaping capture or death is just electrifying. And it does move the French court, Louis XVI in particular, with his foreign minister, Charles Vergennes, to come to the conclusion that, yes, these Americans can do it on the battlefield, that we have been waiting to commit ourselves to make sure that they're capable enough of actually putting up excuse me, a sustained fight against the British, and that if we come in helping them not just with clandestine arms and munitions, gunpowder and so on, but if we send troops and a naval force, that we can help to really tip the tide. And it's the news of Saratoga, news from Germantown, which is a tactical defeat for the Americans, but it shows that they've still got fighting moxie, and other reports that are coming from America reaching Versailles, convincing Louis that, okay, yes, I am a French absolute monarch, but I'm going to align myself with these Republican wannabes in America. So it's a turning point in our national history, not just the Revolution.
Yeah. And the other thing that happens, of course, after that is the British shift their sights to the southern colonies or the southern states by that time, in sort of trying to shift things out of that theater from New York. I guess taking Philadelphia had ended up really being a disaster. That they get out of there. And so Savannah comes into your story twice. It's lost in December of 1778. And then the following October, the British, I should say the Americans and their allies, of course, attempt to retake the city. D'Estaing comes up from the Caribbean. We see this alliance finally at work. In fact, I think you note that here in Savannah is the first time that British and French troops actually fire at each other on American soil.
Right.
At least since first time since the French and Indian War 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, if you will, I know you're going to be in Savannah actually on the anniversary of this momentous conflict. It took place half a mile from where I'm sitting right here. You and I have walked that battlefield together on your last trip here. It's a very moving account. It's also unbelievably frustrating because it feels like D'Estaing just blew it. He really messed it up. And then we corresponded about this a little bit, but it just sort of feels like it was a missed opportunity there.
A catastrophe, really. Yeah, I love the story of Savannah, as sad as it is for the home team, and as disastrous as it is for the French and Americans who are there. There's no reason why Savannah shouldn't have been recaptured. As you point out, the British arrive here in some force. The American garrison is not very well commanded. The loss of the town is almost foreordained from the time that the British force shows up. The British do some reinforcing of Savannah. Now, Savannah's it's a tiny little outpost in the middle of nowhere, right on the edge
Right.
of the Savannah River. The British do some reinforcing, but they have not made it into a fortress. They have not made it impregnable by any means. And so the French willingness to provide tangible assistance to the Americans in the form of a fleet is supposed to play out in Savannah, among other places. Admiral D'Estaing, who started his military life as an Army officer and then switches to the Navy, which seems a little strange to us, but was not terribly unusual in the French military, is not a particularly capable fighting sea dog, and he's plagued with bad luck throughout much of his career. He is ostensibly aligned with the American force under General Benjamin Lincoln, who has fought at Saratoga. He's been badly wounded in the leg, as General Arnold had been. Lincoln has spent a long time recuperating from this serious wound, but he leads a force from Charleston down from the landward side of Savannah. D'Estaing and the French have arrived with a pretty substantial fleet off the coast. They come ashore. The encirclement of Savannah begins. D'Estaing is determined that this has got to happen fast. He's got to get the fleet back to France before hurricane season sets in. The mariners were always wary of hurricane season in the southern reaches of America and the West Indies. And so when the conventional siege doesn't pry the British out of Savannah, and if anything, the British seem to be digging in ever deeper and seem to be more resolute than ever about hanging on to the city, D'Estaing, claiming he's pressured from the Americans, among other things, decides he's going to launch a conventional assault. It goes about as badly as it could possibly go. D'Estaing is wounded. There are lots of American and French soldiers who are killed or wounded. The British have some casualties, but they're relatively minor, modest in comparison to the attacking force. D'Estaing is carried on a stretcher away from town, and that's it for Savannah. The French decide that they're going to evacuate. Lincoln takes his force and leaves Savannah. They head back to South Carolina. And the British are left with Savannah really until the end of the war. The success at Charleston at Sullivan's Island in June of 1776 had kept the British out of the South, out of the American South, for several years. It's one of the great consequences of that improbable victory at Sullivan's Island. And it looked as though if they had been able to evict the British from Savannah, that it would completely block British ambitions of having a Southern campaign that would allow the British to begin rolling up the dissident colonies from the South, first Georgia, then South Carolina, then North Carolina, then Virginia. This is their vision. This is the campaign that they want to wage. And it looks, after the failure in Savannah, that's now they've got a foot in the door. They've got the Savannah River Valley back under British control, at least for a while. And so it's not only a tactical defeat, it's a strategic defeat, because it looks like it is going to put paid to American ambitions to hold the line in the South, and put momentum, impetus behind this British Southern strategy.
Yeah, and 6 months later, Charleston falls. So then you've got these two big dominoes.
Correct, and that's a catastrophe. 5,000 American troops in Charleston surrender in May of 1780. One of the greatest catastrophes of the war for the Americans. And so, and the British immediately began to try to seize the rest of South Carolina, with an idea of continuing to move northward.
Right, and so that will of course lead off in your third volume here. I want to be mindful of your time, Rick. So I wanted to ask one of the questions that I was going to ask right at the very beginning, but I'll ask now, and that is, you're 2/3 of the way to the goal line, with a lot of research. Are you any regrets on your part that you bit off this big 3-volume thing? I mean, it's a great story, and you obviously enjoy talking about it. As you stand here now, looking toward the horizon, toward Yorktown and beyond, and really, we know the Revolution did with Yorktown, that there's the evacuation of these major southern and northern cities you're talking about. But where do you stand? Where does Rick Atkinson, the writer and researcher and father and grandfather, stand now with this subject?
Yeah, well, it's too late now
now you ask me. Yeah,
I'm afraid I'm committed, Stan.
Yeah.
I said to my wife a couple of days ago, I'm kind of looking forward to this third and final act. Again, the story is so improbable. It's so extraordinary. The characters will remain larger than life in many respects. The ultimate success seems so unlikely at some point.
Right.
After the fall of Charleston, and things are looking pretty bleak. And the Yorktown campaign is spectacular as just a narrative act. So I will be busy for the next several months shilling this second volume. That's part of the deal. But I'm looking forward to. I've already begun reading, trying to get smarter about what happens in the last couple of years of the war. You're right; it doesn't end at Yorktown. The peace treaties are not going to be signed until 1783. But I'm already trying to get smarter about what happens and thinking about how to organize that third book, and I'm looking forward to it. I don't have any illusions that it's going to take me any less than the 6 years that the last book took me, and the 6 years before that one. But I do have my eye on the fall of 1781, when Yorktown happened, and I think if I'm not done by then, I'll have made a misstep somewhere.
Yeah. In fact, I think it was George Will in his review of your book that said, you'll be writing about Yorktown when we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of that event as well. One of the great stories in the third volume that you'll be tackling is Benedict Arnold. Again, another tragic figure, and we don't have to talk about it now, but you follow him in the first volume through Montreal or Quebec, I guess. And he just always seems to be just not quite where he wants to be. And I know that that's going to be part of the great drama of that. What happens with he in Washington. You also, I want to just take a minute. You have been heavily involved in the upcoming Ken Burns 12-part series on the Revolution. What's that been like for you as you put the finishing touches on this book and continue your work?
Yeah, Ken Burns' next big project, next big film is a 12-hour, 6-part documentary on the American Revolution. He's been working on it for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think he started in 2014, so maybe a little more than 10 years. And it will air on PBS in mid-November. I've been involved for several years, both on camera and reading scripts and advising him. I've seen the whole 12 hours, and it's fantastic. It's a beautiful film. It's historically rigorous. He's got challenges, as you can imagine. There are no living veterans. There are no photographs. The things that a filmmaker, documentarian, would seem to need to bring to life something from the 18th century are hard to come by, and he does it quite brilliantly. Mm-hmm. I've been involved recently in helping him to promote it. We were in Richmond and Williamsburg last month. Last week, this is middle of April, we were in Lexington and Concord together. He shows 40-minute clip reels, they're called. They're fragments of the film that he puts together. And he draws big, adoring crowds. You can imagine Lexington and Concord. He shows the sequence from this film of Lexington and Concord. And it's wonderfully done. And it's fun to be around him and his Florentine Films gang, including his two producer directors, Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt. In part because they are so committed to our common history. They are true believers that this is one of the great stories in the history of mankind, something that we can be proud of, something we can learn from, something that can inspire us, something that can caution us. He does not avert his eyes from the painful aspects of our national history: slavery, the lack of empowerment for women, the fact that this was a civil war, a nasty civil war before the Civil War. All these things he deals with in a straightforward, comprehensive fashion, and I think he's made a film that people are really going to like, and it's certainly something he can be proud of.
And what a time for it to land in our national scene.
Well, that's right. It's the semi-quincentennial, which sounds like a medical procedure, but it's actually the 250th anniversary of the founding of the country. And he did it quite deliberately. He knew that it was coming up, and and it's intended to resonate with what we hope will be national reflection as well as national celebration about this birthday event.
Absolutely. Well, Rick, thanks so much for coming on to talk about this second volume of your Revolution Trilogy. Good luck as you go forward with research and writing and promoting this book and all the other great things that you're doing. I look forward to seeing you here in October 9, 2025. Rick Atkinson is going to be in Savannah on the anniversary of the Siege of Savannah, and he and I will sit down and continue our conversation. Rick, continued good luck. Great to see you, my friend. Thank you for being here.
Stan, there's no one I enjoy talking to more about these things. I look forward to seeing you in October.
My thanks to Rick Atkinson for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at penguinrandomhouse.com and at rickatkinson.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar shot-heard round-the-world podcasts about great books and the authors who write them, like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.